Welcome back to the Fantasy Endgame. I'm Pierre. He's Chris. We're here to help you win. As always, this time we're going to talk playoffs because that's what it's all about. You need to know who is going to carry your team. Look, there are a lot of really great running backs in the league right now, but you want to know that you have the right one as your RB1. We're talking about the guys who have the most production at the position and some of the most favorable schedules for the fantasy playoffs from weeks 15 through 17 for most leagues. All right, so let's start at number 12. This was tough, right? A lot of guys who were kind of right there on the fringe considered Aaron Jones for this spot, but we're going to give it to Rhamondre Stevenson. Chris, why do you feel good about Rhamondre as an RB1 during the fantasy playoffs?
Yeah, again, it was very close between him and Jones. They kind of have similar schedules as far as, difficulty. Neither one has smash schedules. I just feel a little bit better about Rhamondre's role in this offense. He gets carries, he gets all the targets, all the receptions out of the backfield here. A.J. Dillon does steal some targets. He does steal some carries. I know Damien Harris steals some carries when he's actually healthy, but who knows if he'll even be healthy. But not enough for me to really knock Rhamondre. So very close between these two, but I think Rhamondre gets a slight edge.
Yeah, and again, kind of an unexpected development. Stevenson is the pass catching back and the early down back for the most part. I mean, he's got that floor that you like, and you know this team will constantly begin and end with the run game on offense. That's just how the Bill Belichick team goes, at least without Tom Brady. All right, so now we got number 11, a guy, arguably would be higher if not for the schedule. It's absolutely brutal. Some people might be shocked to see Joe Mixon outside the top 10, but I think this is where he belongs. I mean, Chris, is this an overreaction to the schedule, or you think this is justified?
No, I think this is justified. I mean, we're talking about Tampa Bay, New England, and Buffalo, like three of the toughest run defenses you could possibly face. I know Joe Mixon gets the volume, and he has that touchdown upside, but man, in these matchups, you can't expect him to go out there and smash 3 straight weeks. And there's running backs who are just as good or better than Joe Mixon. They have much better schedules. So, I mean, yeah, if you got Joe Mixon, you're rolling him out every week. But man, he could definitely struggle in the fantasy playoffs.
And this really has nothing to do with the fact that he missed a game with concussion. He'll be back. He'll be fine. Health-wise, that's not the issue. Let's not forget, it's been kind of a roller coaster year for Mixon. Remember about mid-season, a lot of people were panicking on Mixon. He was so inefficient. He wasn't scoring touchdowns. And then that 5-touchdown game cured everything. Not so fast. He could still be that guy who's struggling to get big yardage with these matchups down the stretch. I don't think I can put him in the top 10. So still a guy you have to start, but just don't expect him to be a league winner necessarily. All right, now coming in at number 10, we have Travis Etienne. Guy also banged up with a foot issue, should be a non-issue going forward. As long as he stays healthy, he's pretty much the guy in Jacksonville. How do you think he will do as far as those weeks go?
Yeah, again, he has 2 really tough matchups to start the playoffs with Dallas and then the Jets, but then he gets a smash matchup against Houston. I think that's what propels him up here. But you got to make it to week 17 to reap the rewards of that matchup, right? So, he's pretty matchup proof because he's so talented, but still, with those first 2 matchups, might struggle a little bit in weeks 15 and 16. But man, if you can get to week 17 with Travis Etienne, you're going to be loving life for sure.
Yeah, I'll admit, I think out of all the guys we're going to talk about here, he might carry the most risk. But he also has some of the highest upside. He's got a really, even though he's getting almost all the touches in that backfield, he doesn't need a ton of touches because he's so explosive. So, gotta like that upside. You gotta keep him in your lineup. All right, then coming in number 9, again, some people will say he should be higher, should be top 5. But let's talk about Nick Chubb. I mean, he's pretty much matchup proof. Why does he slot in here?
I mean, he is matchup proof, but you'd still prefer Nick Chubb in better matchups. Baltimore, New Orleans, and Washington, that's not what you want to see in the fantasy playoffs. These are all, top 10 defenses against the run, or at least like top 12. But yeah, like you said, Nick Chubb is matchup proof. But look, I mean, we've seen it the last few weeks. I know he had a nice game in week 12, but that's only because they went to overtime, and that's only because Amari Cooper caught a long pass, got him to the 1, and he was able to plunge it into the end zone with literally like less than 30 seconds to go in an overtime game. Like, without a touchdown, he doesn't have, doesn't give you a whole lot because he's not going to catch 5 or 6 passes. So with these matchups, I mean, he can always score on any given week, but it's hard to see Nick Chubb putting up huge fantasy games in these 3 games. And there's, again, like I talked about with Mixon, there are just guys that we're going to talk about who are just as good in fantasy or better that have way better matchups. So it's hard to see Chubb outscoring those guys.
And another big question that we have to ask is, how does Deshaun Watson at quarterback now change the dynamic, if at all, of this offense? Obviously, they want to run heavy script with Jacoby Brissett. No offense, but more of a game manager type at quarterback. Do you think they open things up? Do you think Chubb maybe gets a little less of the workload going down the stretch here?
I mean, probably, but probably not, because he's still so good. I think the Browns will continue to lean on him.
All right, fair enough. But again, a guy you pretty much can't bench ever. But again, don't necessarily expect him to have his best games of the season in the final weeks of the season. All right, now we're down to number 8. You're glad if you picked up Kenneth Walker off of waivers. Looks like he might be a league winner, but will he do it down the stretch here in the last couple of weeks of the fantasy season? He's got San Francisco, which is one of the best run defenses in the league. Then it gets Kansas City. You got to wonder about the game script there. And then the Jets. That doesn't sound like an easy slate.
No, I mean, he should do well in that Kansas City matchup there in Week 16. Week 17 against the Jets, not great. I mean, Week 15 against 49ers, not great at all. You got to really hope that, you get the bye. But still, Kenneth Walker, he's young. We've seen it. Like, even in bad matchups, it doesn't matter because he has so much touchdown upside. He can hit a home run on any play, any given play. And this Seattle offense has actually been much, much better than we expected. So he's kind of like right there with Nick Chubb for me. If somebody wanted to put Chubb ahead of him, I would have no arguments with that because they're kind of the same guy. Really good running backs, don't catch a lot of passes, have touchdown upside, but they both have tough matchups. So close with Chubb and him, but got him slightly ahead because at least he gets KC in week 16, and Chubb doesn't really have any matchups I like in the playoffs.
At the number 7 spot, we have Dalvin Cook. He's stayed intact. He's been good pretty much every week. So we have him ahead of some of those other studs we mentioned because his schedule definitely looks more favorable. Tell me what you expect to see out of Dalvin Cook and the Vikings, who are now front runners for one of the top seeds, if not the top seed in the NFC playoff race.
Yeah, I think if you have Dalvin Cook, you could potentially be getting the best Dalvin Cook all year in the fantasy playoffs because he has 3, really good matchups. The Colts, they're not a great matchup, but they're kind of like middle of the road. Then you got the Giants, who are really bad against running backs, and then Green Bay, who's really bad against running backs. We could see the best 3-game stretch of Dalvin Cook that we've seen all year. So I know it's been a really up and down season for Dalvin Cook, but I think he'll finish strong. Gotta love that schedule.
Yeah, and the only thing I think Dalvin Cook owners are worried about is maybe have some PTSD from last year when he got hurt and then had a bad game coming back toward the fantasy playoffs last season. Let's hope that doesn't happen again. Then at number 6, a guy who, could we be any higher on Josh Jacobs at this point? There's an argument you could say he's just been the most valuable fantasy running back based on where he was drafted this year. But will he be the most valuable in the fantasy playoffs? Well, we have him at number 6. Some people will say that's too low. Why do you think it's not?
I get it. He's just coming off a huge game. He'll probably have another huge game here in Week 13 against the Chargers. But, man, New England and San Francisco in the fantasy playoffs. He does sandwich those matchups with Pittsburgh, but I know he's matchup proof. I know he's catching passes, but still, again, we're talking about the most elite fantasy running backs now, and when we look at the next 5, they all have matchups in the playoffs that you're not scared of. You're not really going to be scared away by their matchups. If he had better matchups, absolutely he'd be higher, and maybe this will end up being too low, but man, New England and San Francisco in the fantasy playoffs, that's brutal. So I think 6 is fair.
Yeah, and again, saying that guy is the number 6 best running back, in the league, that's still a compliment, right? This is not a diss. But again, you're talking about New England, San Francisco, the number 1 and 2 defense in terms of restricting fantasy points to running backs. You have to take that into account. But you're still starting Josh Jacobs. Now, number 5, a guy who hasn't been as hot lately, but we're still high on Saquon Barkley. Why?
Well, a couple of things. Number one, they should be getting their 2 starting offensive linemen back who they've missed, and it's been obvious that they have missed them. Saw a stat today. In the games with those linemen, Saquon Barkley's averaging 129 yards. In the games without him, he's averaging like 79 yards. So that would be a big plus or big help. But also, you look at this playoff schedule. Washington, okay, that's brutal. That's not good. But then he gets Minnesota and Indiana. Those are 2 great matchups. He should be able to smash in those spots. So, like a guy like Jacobs has 2 terrible matchups. Saquon's only got 1, and then he has 2 really good matchups. It should be a great fantasy playoffs for Saquon. I think kind of going through a slow stretch right now, but I think he rebounds and has some of his best games in the fantasy playoffs as well.
Yeah, and don't let recency bias get the best of you. Even though the last couple of weeks haven't been great for Saquon, let's not forget, for a long time, he was the RB1 in fantasy. He could still wind up that way by season's end. Who knows? All right, and then we're down to number 4, or should I say up to number 4. We're going with Christian McCaffrey. Now, this is interesting. McCaffrey hasn't quite put up the numbers we would hope in San Francisco, but now Elijah Mitchell is out for the rest of the regular season. What does that mean for CMC?
I mean, it should mean all the work for CMC, but now we're hearing he's got some kind of like knee irritation that they're going to have to manage. And you got to wonder, San Francisco, they're smart, right? Maybe they're trying to manage his workload because they need him for the real NFL playoffs, not our fantasy playoffs, right? But I mean, he gets Seattle and Las Vegas in the playoffs. He also gets Washington like Saquon, but still, he's pretty much matchup proof. And when you give him Seattle and Las Vegas, he could destroy those matchups. So, yeah, to me, if it wasn't for the knee thing, that I probably would have him a little bit higher. Plus, the next 3 guys we're going to talk about are all studs with fantastic matchups. So, I mean, nothing wrong with 4. I think 4 is perfect for CMC.
Yeah, again, if there wasn't always that kind of lingering doubt about whether he'll stay healthy, you could just make an argument for him at the top spot. But look, I like the fact that we know San Francisco also fighting for playoff position. They want to try to get a bye if possible. At the very least, make sure they clinch a divisional title. So I think they're going to have to ride CMC down the stretch. And then at number 3, welcome back to the elite, Jonathan Taylor. Does he keep it going? And how can you justify him over these guys like CMC and Saquon Barkley? I mean, is it just the schedule or something else?
I mean, it's definitely the schedule, but it's also the fact that he's looked great since coming back from the injury. Looks like the Jonathan Taylor we expected to have, one of the best running backs in football. He's young, he's explosive, and look at that schedule. Minnesota, the Chargers, and the Giants. 3 bottom 10 run defense. The Chargers, he's going to absolutely obliterate the Chargers. He could go off in all these weeks. He could be one of those guys you drafted as the 101. He let you down for most of the season. And then when it mattered, he came around and helped you win a championship. He could be that good in the fantasy playoffs.
Well, what makes me feel good about JT is now we know that as crazy as everything that's happening in Indianapolis is, at least we know the Colts aren't just outright tanking. We got Matt Ryan at quarterback. They're actually running JT. This team is competing, and Taylor is a big part of that. So you have to rely on him down the stretch. Number 2, it's your guy, Derrick Henry. And I know that you're buying fully into him potentially winning your league because you went out and traded for him, and you were telling everyone else to trade for him before the deadline. So let's remind everyone why.
Yeah, it's the schedule. I mean, we've seen Derrick Henry. Look, I traded for Derrick Henry in 2 leagues to try to help me win a championship. But I'm going to admit that Derrick Henry is just basically a plotter at this point. He's just a volume-based plotter. We even saw it on that long catch where he fumbled. There's no way Derrick Henry last year or 2 years ago doesn't score on that play. He gets caught from behind and fumbles. But look, he still gets insane volume, and he gets the Chargers and the Texans in the fantasy playoffs. The 2 worst run defenses, he gets both of them in the fantasy playoffs. Now, he does end with Dallas. That could be a tough game, but by then, you're in your championship. He could absolutely just go off in those first 2 games. It was close between him and Jonathan Taylor. I think you and I kind of debated Derrick Henry, Jonathan Taylor. We decided Derrick Henry at 2. But those first two matchups, he could absolutely go nuclear in those games.
You know what's interesting too, jump throw, touchdown passes aside, that Derrick Henry's been used in more ways. He's been used a little bit more as a pass catcher. And, one big play, like you said, where I know it's hard to look slow when you run for 69 yards, but like you said, maybe in the past he would have broken that, but he still ran for 69 yards and it was on a reception and he's catching some passes. And the Titans, they're just going to keep running him to the ground as long as possible. And this is also a team competing for playoffs. So, yeah, you've got to feel solid about Henry down the stretch, too. And then number one, it's no surprise. It's the guy who just can't stop catching passes and might actually break CMC's record for receptions by running back in the season. Of course, I'm talking about Austin Ekeler. So naturally, this means we think he's going to keep doing what he's doing, right?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, you got to, no reason to think he won't. And look, he actually doesn't have a very good playoff schedule. He gets, Tennessee and the Rams in the fantasy playoffs. But it doesn't matter for Austin Ekeler because you don't care about his 20 rushing yards in week 12. And he smashed because he had 15 targets. He caught 12, 13 passes, scored a touchdown. It doesn't matter the matchup because you're not putting Austin Ekeler in your lineup hoping for a 100-yard rushing game. You're hoping for 8+ catches, which he can do on any given week. Like you said, he's on pace to break McCaffrey's record. If he does that, he's going to smash. He'll smash in the playoffs regardless of matchup. Has such an incredibly high floor to go with an incredibly high ceiling. He has to be number one.
Chargers fans don't all love Joe Lombardi, their offensive coordinator. A lot of fantasy managers probably pretty ambivalent at best about him. But if you have Austin Ekeler on your team, you should love Joe Lombardi because it's like every other play call is a straight pass to Ekeler. He's not getting dump offs or check downs. It's designed. They're intentionally targeting the hell out of Austin Ekeler, and it's going to continue. And he's scoring touchdowns. You've got to love him. He's going to be the number one running back going forward. I know it. Those are the top running backs for the fantasy playoffs. Hopefully you get there. We're going to try to help you win throughout the playoffs. We have start-sit advice, waiver wire advice, everything you need as always. Let's do it for week 13 and get you into the playoffs. Check out this playlist right here with all the fantasy advice that you could possibly need.